Robert and these fine musicians for being here. Thanks to all of you for braving the weather today, though I actually think, I was telling Shanny, I think this is good Baroque music weather. When the rain is coming down outside, we have some lovely music to listen to. Thanks so much to Maison Française for your ever-generous support for musical events. Our panel today, as Shanny has intimated, has 2 points of focus. On the one hand, we really do want to provide an introduction to some of the wonderful music that's going to be performed on this concert on Sunday, right nearby. But also, we do not want to make this exclusionary for those who maybe are not going to the concert. So we're going to be touching on some pieces from the concert, but also touching on some bigger themes of what makes this music so special, French music of the early 18th century. And sprinkled throughout our conversation, we are so lucky to have these wonderful musicians from the historically informed performance ensemble Juilliard 415 with us. The structure of the events, I think I'm going to talk a little bit to the musicians and have them introduce themselves. Then Robert and I will talk a little bit about the Rameau program, and then we'll thematize some of those issues that we raised through specific musical performance. So we should have about an hour of conversation and musical examples. So if we could begin by introducing our musicians. So we have Ryan Chang on the violin, Andrew Kotrubas on cello, and Danny Zanatini Frank on theorbo. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about your instrument. What makes your instrument sort of different from how it might be played in a contemporary ensemble? The theorbo is generating the most interest right off the bat. And sort of what your role might be within these orchestral ensembles that they're going to be hearing.
Sure, so I'll start, I guess. My instrument isn't used in a contemporary ensemble, so I got a comment earlier that this is a theorbo, that it looks like a lute, and it does look like a lute because it is a lute. The theorbo was developed, however you want to think about it, in around 1600 in Italy by singers largely and people accompanying song who wanted to figure out a way to create an instrument that would accompany the human voice well. And as a result, they got all these really low bass notes, which you can tell we have all this long extra neck length, and that's what it's for, so you can have longer string lengths for lower notes. And then over the course of the 17th and 18th century, the theorbo became used in all sorts of chamber music and orchestral ensembles just as a basso continuo instrument. So they would play the bass line, which here I'm playing with Andrew, who's playing it on cello, as well as adding additional ornamentation and harmonies on top of that.
That's great. And if there's anything you'd like to demonstrate as you explain, you're also most welcome to do so.
Yeah. So
the top 6 strings are kind of tuned like a lute would be.
So, except for the fact that, so this is, it goes up, sort of in force, and then it goes down. Because this is it's too long to have octave strings higher than this one, so you need to make it, they were just trying to come up with a compromise that it would be close and it wouldn't get in the singer's way, basically. And then, so this is great, playing chords, right? No problem. But then, as you go down from here, so this is, so if I'm accompanying a singer in an ensemble and I want to make a moment particularly pointed, I might go down to one of those lower notes. Yeah, that's why I've got this kind of thing.
Hi, I'm Andrew Kotrubas. I play the Baroque cello. The cello has an interesting and kind of ambiguous history. It was first came into the world, I think, in the mid-16th century when Amati was commissioned to make a consort of violin instruments. So it's really just a big violin. And it was really ambiguously named over the years, depending on places, until it got standardized actually by the French, I'd say, around the time of this music that we're going to play. The terminology really stuck, and they called it the cello. It was mostly an accompaniment, accompanamental instrument. solo repertoire started emerging for it around the middle to end of the 17th century. And
Hi, I'm Ryan Cheng. I play the Baroque violin. So some of you might know this already, but for those who don't, the Baroque violin is a wonderful instrument. And the main difference, between this one and the regular one is it's older. No, I'm kidding. The strings here are made of gut, so wound animal gut twisted into ropes, and you can see that my bow is of a different shape. It's curved, and the effect this has is, well, the strings first of all give far more color than the regular strings, in my opinion. Okay, so and the shape of the bow allows you to play in a much more speaking sort of way. And I really love playing music like this, and French music especially, because I feel like I'm just gently talking to my audience, and my imagination can run free, and I feel like I'm at home. So that's why I play the Baroque violin.
Well, that's become a good advertisement for any of you looking to take up an instrument, I suppose. Yes. Anything you'd like to add to that, Robert?
No, only that these, I think one of the great pleasures of this music is really it's meant to be music of conversation. So we're really speaking together, we're singing together, and we're dancing together, and we'll be exploring that more as we talk.
Wonderful. Let's give our musicians just a little bit of a break for now, and Robert's going to tell us a little bit more about the specific pieces that are on this program on Sunday. So this is, as you have seen from the advertisements, a program dedicated to the music of Jean-Philippe Rameau. As director, a coordinator of Juilliard 415, I'm sure you have a plethora of early music composers to choose from. So how did this particular program come together? Why Rameau? What is his particular position in French operatic history?
Well, for our students especially, I always find it very important every year to do one big French program, because in the Baroque there's basically two musical languages. One is the Italian Baroque that we all know very well, like Vivaldi, Corelli, Handel, Telemann. The other big musical language is the French musical language, which is something that is just not really possible on modern instruments. It's so intimately attached to these particular sonorities. Mm-hmm. So it's also a very subtle, like Ryan was saying, it's a very subtle language that is immensely rewarding the more you get into it, the same way the French language itself is. So I always try to have a big program of French music, and Rameau himself is such an extraordinary musical imagination for the students to discover. This is the first time we've done such a program so early in the year, so a lot of the first year students, we have a 2-year program. The first year students, many of them have never played this repertoire before, so it's wonderfully ear-opening and eye-opening to them. One of the reasons why I am so delighted by Rameau as well is that it's very hard to put on a Rameau opera. We did it a couple of years ago at Juilliard. We did Hippolyte Aricie, his first big breakthrough opera. In order to do a French Baroque opera, however, you need not only a lot of great singers, but you need a huge chorus and you need a huge dance ensemble as well, and an enormous orchestra. So it was always a very expensive form. One of the reasons why it survived in France was because it wasn't necessarily a public opera house. It was, as you know, it was very much cemented by the king until fairly late into the 18th century. But that allowed them to produce these extraordinary spectacles, and the music that Rameau produces for this, I find him a very fascinating figure. He comes to Paris when he's 50. He comes to Paris actually not to necessarily stake his claim as a composer, but actually to oversee his work as a music theorist. He had just put together a hundreds of pages long treatise on harmony, which ended up being extraordinarily revolutionary. And he needed a publisher, and he needed to proofread the galleys. So he was there. It took him then, once he had arrived in Paris, it really took him about 10 years before he actually made it into the operatic scene. So one of the cool things about Rameau is that his whole operatic career happens after he's 50. It's this amazing second act. And he absolutely dominates the musical scene from his very first opera, Hippolyte, in 1733 till he dies, really. And it's a voice that I find it fascinating because there's really no kind of followers of Rameau. Would you say they really take a very different direction after Rameau?
Yeah, he really defines this particular era. The first half of the 18th century is defined by this sound of Rameau, absolutely. And then, of course, chorals spring up around him very shortly. Amongst the output of Rameau, how did you decide which pieces you were going to do? So maybe you can tell the audience about which operas you're extracting on this program, where they fit in his career, how you selected them.
Yeah, he wrote so many operas. In fact, he wrote so many operas at one point in 1749 that Paris Opéra said, please don't write quite so many operas because we can't put them all on. They were extraordinarily popular until the very end of his life. But these, the two that we're playing, the music that we're drawing from, are from two of his first operas, not Hippolyte, but the one after that, the big tragédie lyrique that he wrote in 1737, which is called Castor and Pollux. That's the story of two mythical brothers. They're Gemini, in fact, they're the constellation Gemini. And they are twins, but miraculously one of them has Zeus as his father and the other has a mortal as his father. Leda, their mother, also, I didn't realize this until this morning, also had two girls in the same womb.
It's a complicated family
history. It's a very complicated family history. But the short story is that Castor, the mortal one, gets killed, and his brother goes down to take his place in the underworld, and it's an interesting story in that it's a story of brotherly love rather than being one of romantic love, which is usually the case. But this means we get to have excursions to hell, which is always very exciting. It gives us a huge scope of dramatic music to play with, because one of the things about French opera, especially Rameau, is that it's not just opera that's sung, it's opera that's danced. And the dances are really at the heart of the repertoire. So for us, this is a chance to explore not only the great dances of Castor and of the other opera we're doing, which is Dardanus from 1739, but also to include some of the great airs as well, which is wonderful because it's a chance for the vocal arts students at Juilliard to discover this repertoire, which otherwise it's really a repertoire that they would otherwise never come across, I think.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And I mean, as you said, you're doing it, you might be surprising for people coming in to think, oh, you're doing two Rameau operas in one evening? No. Extracts, including a lot of airs and a lot of dance music. And do you want to extrapolate just a little further before we jump into thinking about dance music on these instruments, about the role of dance in French opera in particular, or why is dance so important for Rameau? You're going to hear so many dances at the concerts on Sunday as well as here. But why is dance so prevalent within French opera as well as a whole?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Dance, the way French operas work, every act ends not like Italian opera, where you have a huge, spectacular da capo aria, and everyone screams and throws things at the stage. The Italian opera actually often works with leaving fewer and fewer characters on stage, so you're just left with one star to finish the act. French opera works the other way. There are more and more characters come on stage, and what ends every act is a huge, what's called a divertissement in entertainment. But what's interesting is that the divertissement always is plot-related. There's always a reason for that to happen. It's not just dance for the sake of dance. So sometimes it's, like in Castor, we'll be doing one dance that is actually kind of an enactment of the battle in which Castor dies, these athletic air. But then also there's a whole scene of when Castor ends up in the underworld, which turns out to be a rather nice place because it's pagan times. So he's actually in the Champs-Élysées, the Elysian Fields, literally. And there are all these shades there who show him how beautiful it is and how he should not leave, that it's actually really wonderful. So we'll be doing a set of dances and sung dances, which is interesting, from this whole scene in the Champs-Élysées. So you have this very close connection between dance and song, and I think also a very close connection between dance and poetry, that in some ways dance forms are a kind of musical poetry. It's very important for French culture. That seems to be one of the most important things.
Yeah, it's a really important clarification. And this is maybe a good point of transition to start thinking about some of the pieces we could play and hearing some of the dance music. So we have a bit of an awkward transition here, an awkward question of this evening, because you might be thinking, well, how are you going to be putting on a Rameau opera in 20 minutes in this room with these 4 instrumentalists? And the answer is, in fact, we are not. We're going to be thinking about dance music through a contemporary of Rameau, through his contemporary, who is Jean-Philippe, one of the most important violinists of the 18th century. He actually was also an opera composer, and he actually bested Rameau as an opera composer in the sense that he wrote his first opera on his 51st birthday, as opposed to Rameau writing his first opera on his 50th birthday. But what these dances are very interesting is that they show the huge influence between the sphere of the theater in 18th century France and the sphere of what might happen in the domestic sphere. So we have all of these operas in which many, many dances are performed. Then we have an explosion of printed music happening sort of outside the opera house in this vibrant capital of Paris. So we have composers like Leclerc who are composing dances inspired by operatic dances to be performed by instruments in the home. And so we'll give to you as this taste of operatic dance through that sort of vibrant public sphere of 18th century Paris. Yeah. Do you want to tell us anything in particular about the piece that we'll hear some extracts from before we hear about the dances within the piece?
Pragmatically speaking, one of the reasons we couldn't actually play too much of our program from Sunday is that Rameau is an incredibly inventive orchestrator, and so much of his effects rely on the variety of instruments that are used in the texture that it's actually, when we looked at the score, it's actually very hard to boil it down to a chamber music size. It's just so much tied to the colors of the orchestra. But this is a piece that Leclerc put together in just around the same time as Castor. So it's very much the same musical language as what Rameau is working in. And this is called one of his these collections of dances that he calls these récréations de musique. So they're just musical delights, recreations.
Are we going to, maybe we'll move dance by dance, and you can speak a little bit about each dance before we play them. Are we starting with some minuets?
Yes. So one of the things about this whole language of dance in France is that each form has its own very particular cultural code around it, particular form, particular rhythms, and where they would be done as well. So, for example, the minuet you see rarely on an operatic stage. It's mostly a social dance. In fact, it was the dance that all of you would have danced. You all know how to do this dance.
There will be a test at the
There
end.
will be a test at the end. It's a fairly simple step to learn, and this would be one of the very, very central dances in a gathering, in a ball. A social ball, everyone, couple by couple, would do a minuet together while everyone else sort of checks them out and says, what's that like? So it's a triple time dance, and like so many of these dances, it goes in pairs. So there's a first minuet, there's a second minuet in minor, and then we go back to the first minuet.
Wonderful. I will take all the microphones. The minuet from Leclerc's Récréation de musique from 1736. gavotte. I was also wondering if maybe one of our violinists, if you wanted to tell us a little bit about the ornamentation in this piece, or the violin idiom, given that this is such an important violin composer in the 18th century.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm thinking on the spot.
All right. I love French music because it's full of these, I guess we could call it mannerisms. So little notes that are added to the main tune to make it more stylish. And in French music, you're going to hear a lot of trill. And then different little notes in the middle, like this. And I just think this lends so much grace. And Leclerc was a violinist, so he wrote some nice ones for us.
He was also a dancer and a lace maker, both qualities I think very nice. One of the other things about this style that you may have noticed is that all the eighth notes that we're playing, which are notated just as straight the language of the French Baroque, it's always swung slightly. It's called notes inégales, or unequal notes. And it's a matter of taste how far you swing that, but it doesn't mean a thing unless one has that swing. So that's actually crucial to the whole world of the French Baroque. There are some, I don't know, I've heard people have speculated about the possibility that French music in Louisiana there might be some very distant connection with the swing that emerges in jazz music. Do you think?
Oh gosh, that's really interesting. I mean, there's a huge circulation of music from France to the Caribbean, to Louisiana, to Philadelphia, to New York. I mean, just following sort of the traces of French migration in the 18th century and 19th century. So it wouldn't be shocking, yeah. But I don't know if anyone's proven that exact particular connection. Yeah, theater music especially. Yeah, it's very transitory.
Do you know if Rameau or Leclerc were heard in the New World?
Yes, well, in bits and pieces. Yeah, we have a little bit less information about Rameau, but certainly instrumental music of Leclerc was transferred into the French Caribbean in the 18th century. Yeah.
That's a good thing. One of the things about these operas that we're playing music from is that they were hugely popular, so popular that like Castor, which is first done in 1737, it remained in repertory into the 1790s, which I find totally fascinating, that it's music that almost survives the revolution, but not quite.
Not quite. Well, it would come back too afterwards. Yes, France has sort of the first canon, we might say, of musical works to develop is very early on because of this connection with the French court system.
Our next dance on the menu is a gavotte. These actually, many of the ones, the minuet, the gavotte, and the finish with the passe-pied, these are all dances that were thought of as kind of galanterie or light dances that are not the big dances of the classic French suite are the allemande, the courante, the sarabande, and the gite. And then there would be these lighter dances which often have connections to country dances. The gavotte is, I believe, from northern France, from Brittany, and it's in many ways a very simple form. It always has the rhythmic pattern of yep, bum, bum, or zap, da, da, dum. So there's always this little introductory two-beat opening. What's fascinating about this very seemingly innocent dance is that it actually becomes one of the most popular dances at the time, not only with Leclerc, but also with Rameau, who I believe wrote more gavottes than anything else for his operas, which is fascinating. And we're doing some very, very beautiful ones on Sunday with just delicious orchestrations. So another reason to come is to hear the variety of gavottes. But here's a beautiful one from Leclerc. Of using gut strings is that gut strings in this weather tend to absorb as much humidity as possible. Seem to work in poetic units, that it really has these beautiful little internal rhymes that you hear, so it sort of forms its own kind of rhyming structure that's quite beautiful.
That's a lovely way of putting it, yeah, so those question and answer phrases and the sort of parallel that in the repeats, yeah, it's just very satisfying, isn't it?
Yeah.
What's up next in the Pacifier? That's it, I feel like that's a slightly less common.
Actually, I think we'll do
oh,
the
you're doing the
Sargon
Sargon
first.
first, okay,
Yeah.
right. Jumping the gun, yes.
So next we have a sarabande, which is one of the great dances. This would be done on stage by a single dancer, and it usually would involve a very complicated choreography. It was one of the most elaborate of the dances. And it's one of these dances that comes from probably the New World. Its origins are a very fast, sexy dance that then, over the course of the 18th century, slows down into this grand court form. It has always, all these dances don't just have grooves, but they often have moods as well. And the sarabande is always very sort of interior. It's kind of a very particularly poetic fun, I find. This sarabande is unusual in that it's not a binary structure like we've heard, that is, first section repeats, then second section repeats. This one is actually in the form what's called a rondeau. So there's A, and then there's B, and then there's A, and then there's C, and then there's A. So it weaves its own story as it unfolds.
the microphone. It's so striking what an emotional range there is. I mean, if you're just thinking of these works as, I mean, even the front page of this this publication says, oh, this is just an easy work to play in the home, basically, but there can be such depth and emotional range between the pieces within the set. Yeah. I wonder if, so we have one more dance to, well, we have two more dances. One more that we can play, maybe we could have some time for audience questions before the grand finale. So if, perhaps as we play this, you could think if you have any questions for our performers or about the concert itself. I also don't know, we haven't really heard from our baseline contingent here. Is there anything you'd like to contribute about your experiences in realizing this and what you have on the page and the challenges or the satisfactions of bringing this music to life?
Yeah, something that's really fun for me as a bassline player of this kind of music is that you really you can't just read what's on the page. You know, if you read it literally, you miss so much, and you really have to have like this understanding of like what we've been talking about, the rhyming and the grammar, and so it's so fun and rewarding to be able to uncover all of those little nuances in the bass line, because especially those dance forms, the groove, the specific groove that each dance has, I think really comes out in the bass line the most, a lot of times. So it's fun to make that happen.
Well, and just add one thing that's great about being a bass player on an instrument like this is that your role, like we're Andrew and I are reading the same part, but we're obviously not playing the same things. And the great joy of this music, of playing the bass part, is like, okay, what's your role in the ensemble? That's kind of up to you. They don't really survive sources telling you exactly, I mean, they tell you more or less guidelines, but exactly what notes to play, when, how. So you have to figure it out from exactly what they're talking about, the affective resonance of music into the rhythmic characteristics, the dance characteristics, whatever it happens to be, and also what is your role in that team? Like Andrew's playing a beautiful bass line. What can I do to augment that? What can I do to augment certain things? What can we do as a team? And that's what's great about getting to play with great musicians all the time. So.
Yeah. One of the real pleasures of this is it's not, I think as we're all saying, it's not just about figuring out how these pieces go. It's actually, a lot of it is just being immersed in this culture as well, getting a sense of what these dances represent, what it would mean to move through space at this time, how you would interact with others. I find it wonderful that all French music has, the tempo indications are never, like Italian music, it's allegro or adagio or presto, but with French music they're always very full of character. It's like this piece should be played proudly, or this piece should be played with nobility. And these are emotions that are not necessarily native to us as 21st century New Yorkers. How noble do you get to be on the subway every day? So it's really interesting to delve into ourselves to find an identity that works with this music.
That's wonderful. So what identity will you be putting on for the Pasquier?
So the Pasquier is, it's a comic piece. It's a little bit like the minuet, but it's much faster, and one of its hallmarks is fantastic syncopations that are delightful. There's no set step for this, it just involves a lot of fast passage work across the stage that would be mostly improvised, in fact.
I'm confused about if Rameau wrote for the court or if you say it was so popular, then obviously more people had to hear it. That's number one. Number two, the way you describe the bass parts being, is that how it was written at the time? And number three, do you think with the ornamentation and the swing thing that you can pretty much always tell Rameau's operas when you hear them?
Good question. Definitely number three for sure, yes. Rameau has a really distinctive, partially it's just, he's so much more creative than almost anyone at the time. It's just, the invention is just so tremendous. And his harmonic languages, because he was a theorist as well, he uses harmonies in really telling ways, which is fantastic. In terms of...
Was it the court or for the popular?
Yes, that's actually, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly opera in France is very, very much associated, tragic opera at this time, very much associated with centers of courtly power. And there's one musicologist who calls French tragic opera at this time the courtiest court opera that ever existed. That said, however, by this time, even by Rameau's time, the center had also, there are performances in Paris. And Rameau is also writing for all sorts of different venues. He starts out at the Fair Theatres of Paris, actually, before he starts writing for the opera. And then there are all sorts of sort of knockoff versions of Rameau that are then put into the print marketplace. Leclerc's wife, the wife of the composer we've been playing, was a music engraver and one of the most prolific music engravers of the 18th century. So the idea that this music is suddenly into more people's hands is really a truth of that time. But so the answer is yes.
Yeah.
I
found it fascinating that when he gets to Paris, he's there as a theorist, but his first gig is to work with the Theatrical, with the fair, which is kind of, I always thought it was kind of like Milton Babbitt writing Forbidden Broadway or something. It's like writing pop tunes that this immensely learned theorist is doing, and it's really interesting. Yeah. So he knew a good tune, that's for sure.
Yeah. And then the bass parts, what you're doing now is how it was written at the time?
Well actually, do you want to show the,
Sure.
yeah.
We're actually, so we have, close to original instruments, and we're also using the scans of the first edition of this music.
It says engraved by his wife.
Yes.
Engraved by the composer's wife.
Yeah. But if you, the bass parts are the bass line, which is what Andrew's playing, but then on top of it you'll see all these numbers, and those are the harmonies which Donnie is playing. So those numbers tell you, it's basically like a fake sheet in jazz. So every time that Donnie plays this, it'll be different. It's entirely improvised what's going on there.
And it was then too?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's part of this, like learning an improvised tradition. You just have to do it. You just have to improvise for a long time. So, yeah.
And just as I said earlier,
The thing that's sort of mystifying and also makes sense if you think about it, which is like the worst phrase ever, but is that they, as I said earlier, they sort of explain how to do it, but but they didn't actually explain how to do it, because to actually, in the same way that you can't learn how to improvise from a book, right? You have to have a teacher who teaches you, oh, well, that's not a good taste, and that's how I learned, because at some point you can have a book that explains to you the principles, but I think so much of what's in this music is it has to be learned from a teacher, and by immersing yourself in the culture and people who know this language very well, who can school you.
I think you're gonna up next, but Joanne.
Yeah, I just wanted to say how much I appreciated the joy that you talked about and took in playing, and I think we really see the conversational element that you mentioned in sort of the way that you are interacting as musicians and looking at each other, and I almost felt like at the end, your foot was coming up, it was getting more dancey. So my question is having to do with, obviously there's this great historical specificity and attention in what you're doing in terms of the score, as you just said, and the musical instruments. I was lucky enough to see the production of Les Âmes Galantes at the Opéra Bastille in Paris with this, if for those of you who don't know it, with ultra-contemporary crump dancing that was combined with this opera, 18th century opera, and I thought it was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. So I'm just wondering about your thoughts on the question of bringing the hyper-contemporary into something that also is very attentive to history and specificity and material practices.
That's a really, really interesting question. I think especially with dance, one of the great dance teachers at the time said that Rameau is actually the one we learn from, the one who teaches all of us, because he offers so much. It's all there in the music, essentially, and it really is some of the most kinetic dance music before Stravinsky. I think it really is very much embodied. I mean, all French dance music is very much in the body, but I think it really works well for a lot of any very, very different choreographies. There's also a fantastic DVD of a production that was done some years ago of Les Paladins, one of the very last of Rameau's operas. And it's by a dance company that includes ballet dancers, hip hop, various kinds of street dancing, and they're all virtuosos, and they were all improvising their choreography to the music, and it's sensational. It really does live.
And I can find that online?
Yeah,
If I want to see it.
yeah, absolutely, yeah, Les Paladins.
Les Paladins.
Yeah, it's really one. There's one dance on a trampoline that is actually spectacular.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, James.
Video. At that time in France, there was a big polemic about opera. Could you elaborate a bit on the place Rameau took in the Chorale des Bouffons?
Oh, that's so interesting. Paris especially is always...
Robert?
The question was what Rameau's role was in the Querelle des Bouffons, the polemics about various kinds of opera at the time. Paris is always a city that has delighted in controversy, even to this day. And I think it's interesting, Rameau was at the center of two of them. At first, when he arrives in town, he is the new guy, and there's a violent pro and anti-Rameau camp. People who loved Lully from the previous generation thought that Rameau's music was geometrical and soulless. And the ones who liked Rameau, they were called ramoneurs, or chimney sweeps. They thought that Lully was just totally old-fashioned. So there was that going on, and then Rameau becomes all the rage. And then suddenly there's this moment when Italian opera buffa comes, especially with the Serva Padrona, which is done in 1752. And
You certainly are doing it.
But I find that it's this moment when this Neapolitan intermezzo is done. Very simple, just two characters on stage, well, one mute character as well. And I think actually it was done partially because it was a cost-saving measure at the opera.
There's all sorts of reasons, but yeah, I mean, it's a hugely pertinent question. I mean, Rameau stands at first for modernity and then comes to stand for the old guard within like 30 years, such as the scope of operatic change in 18th century France. And part of it's about musical style, and part of it's about national politics, and part of it's about court intrigue. all wrapped up in a musical package. So there's so much to unpack with the layers of the music.
Yeah, that's very true. That whole quarrel between the Italians and the French in the 1750s also was a stand-in for a lot of political debates as well. Right? It was kind of fluid.
We had one more, maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll have a show. Yeah.
I have a language question. I'm French born, and I just thought, what about the figured bass? Is there any connection language-wise to figure out something?
I think it's they would call it basse chiffrée in the French score. So really, it was numbered. Really, it literally is just that it has the numbers of the harmony on it.
Yeah, no, but just thinking of the expression to figure out. In English, you do say figured bass.
You do, yes, it's figured bass, yeah, and you do indeed need to figure it out.
yeah, that's what I thought of.
Yeah.
Do we have a question, Marco?
Hi. You had mentioned a lot, or contrasted between the French and the Italian. Could you talk about? I know with François Couperin, the Golfe Réunie, and the kind of with Bach, that was kind of this whole thing. Could you talk about performance or the ephemeral performance? Can you trace back any kind of stylistic or thematic or anything done in performance, not exactly printed, that kind of represents the mixed taste, I guess?
I think this is a really interesting question. It's a question about France's relation to Italy. And it's interesting because the Italians never write about the French at all. But the French are always writing about the Italians. It's fascinating. We have translations of Francesco Caccini's treatise in the mid-17th century. So they were already fascinated by Italianness and Italian possibilities of singing by the 1630s even. It's very, very early. But it becomes a highly contested, either you're pro-Italy or you're pro-France. And Italy may stand for modernity and it's people like François Couperin were very, very, his whole program, as you say, was this bringing together the two tastes of French and Italian. And I think Rameau does that as well. He's very clear, he knew all the stuff that was going on in Italy, and he adopts a lot of the virtuosity and the Italian flair of it. In fact, even with Leclerc, his other collections are mixes of French overtures and Italian sonatas. So they're always, they're very clear on what's going on in Italy, and I think the really gifted composers always want to incorporate that into what they're doing.
Yeah, wonderful questions. Well, then perhaps we will have one closing number. So we're ending with a chaconne, something that Rameau did a lot, something that many opera composers did to bring things to a close. But I do thank you so much for coming. If you have some final questions after we play this piece, of course, you can come up and ask the musicians then. Anything you'd like to do to preface this piece?
No, only that this indeed does, if you can come to the concert, one of the great glories of Rameau are his chaconnes, which are huge and wonderful, and they represent a kind of return to order after all of the drama that's gone on. And in fact, Castor, the chaconne there is quite spectacular, and it really, apparently, the choreography kind of enacted a Copernican universe of the order of the spheres rotating around each other. So I'm afraid we won't be able to do that in the floor of Music Before 1800, but please imagine your own choreographies to this.
Lovely to
Thank
see
you
you all.
so much. I think everyone agrees with me. This has been such a treat. Thank you so much to all of you for bringing this, for enriching what we listened to with the commentary. It was really a wonderful partnership. Thanks to Bill Barclay and Music Before 1800. If you weren't here at the beginning, you can have a discount as a friend of the Maison Française to the concert this Sunday by putting Maison in the code box. The program is